Welcome back. In this segment, we're going to talk about assumption sets. And as you'll recall, assumptions are the fifth characteristic of the structure of the logic bridge for creating clear logical arguments. We've talked about the need for the categorical form, the nature of the start of the line of reasoning, the nature of the finish, and what constitutes the linkage between each of the premises. And we have previously discussed assumptions and how they support individual premises. Just as a review, this was an example we discussed in which a necessary assumption was shown to support premise number 2. Premise number 2 was any who was born in Hawaii is a natural-born U.S. citizen. And for that to be true, one of the assumptions is that the person was born when Hawaii was a state or U.S. territory. We also did an example with an ancillary support. Here we had the same premise, and in this case, if you knew that the person was born in 1961, this premise would be a little stronger because you would know they were born after Hawaii had been made a state. So assumptions can come about based on the context of the premise. So you can have unique assumptions that go with any particular context. But you can also have assumption sets or recurring groups of assumptions that typically accompany a particular type of premise. And I've divided those sets into 3 groups. One is when the question of a reliability of a source of information is involved. The next one is when you're using analogy. And the last one is when you're using sample generalizing. So the first one we're going to discuss right here is the reliability of a source of information. And the subset of that is when that source is a witness. So here we have 2 premises. The first premise is the president was born in Hawaii according to the witness. And the second premise is one who was born in Hawaii according to the witness was born in Hawaii. This leads to our conclusion, the president was born in Hawaii. So in premise number 2, the level of certainty of that premise relies upon the reliability of the witness. If the witness says something, then you can count on it actually being true. And here we have a typical set, there can be more, of the kind of assumptions that accompany anytime you're relying on a witness testimony. I won't go through all of them. You can read them at your leisure, but some obvious ones are the witness had personal knowledge, or they were in a position to know. This means when they claim something, for example, that somebody was born in Hawaii and they were a witness, if you could show they were actually in Florida at the time, then they didn't have personal knowledge. Here, to see, the assumption is they had the necessary, for example, perceptual capabilities. So if they say they saw the event, but they had very poor vision and needed glasses to see, then if they weren't wearing their glasses, the certainty of this premise could be seriously eroded. So these are sets that you should have handy. This set, whenever you're using a witness as a source of information to get the complete picture in assessing the strength of an argument. Here you can see it in a graphic form. We've got the two premises we've just discussed, which you can see here in the logic bridge and here. But this second premise right here has 7 assumptions that provide support for the strength of this premise to sustain the certainty that passes through it. And you could pull out any one of these, and this whole pillar of assumptions could collapse. And if that happens, then this connection could collapse, and the certainty that would be traveling along this line of reasoning would never reach the finish. So it's important to recognize where assumptions exist. So now we've talked about the assumptions that accompany with the witness as the source of information. You can also have an expert as the source of information. Here we have 2 premises. The president had an authentic birth certificate according to the expert. One who had an authentic birth certificate according to the expert had an authentic birth certificate. So here the reliability depends upon the expert. Here you can see a number of assumptions that accompany anytime you have this reliance on an expert. For example, the expert had sufficient qualifications and stature. 2b, the expert relied upon a theory or technique that has general acceptance in the scientific field or study. 2c, the expert made proper use of the theory or technique. 2d, the error rate of the techniques acceptable for the question at hand. And you can see, so these are the set of assumptions that always have to be figured into your structure of your argument when you're dealing with reliance on the statement of an expert. Well, when we're considering the reliability of a source, we can also consider when that depends on an instrument. So for example, here our first premise is the birth certificate ink was authentic according to the instrument. Premise number 2 is one that was authentic according to the instrument was authentic. Therefore, our conclusion, the birth certificate ink was authentic. So here, the question of reliability depends on this instrument. And there's a number of assumptions that typically accompany that type of claim. Here as a premise. 2a, the instrument was properly calibrated. So if you can show it wasn't properly calibrated, the level of certainty of this premise number 2 is greatly diminished. The instrument was administered and read correctly. The readings were recorded accurately. The readings were not altered. And the readings were sufficiently probative. So whenever a reliability of the source arises and it depends on an instrument, these are assumptions that need to figure into the total structure of your argument. Moving past reliability of source, now we're going to address when we're working with analogy. Here, for example, our premise number 1 is the president is caught in a scandal that is similar to the Nixon scandal. Premise number 2, anyone who is caught in a scandal that is similar to the Nixon scandal should, by analogy, resign. And therefore our conclusion, the president should, by analogy, resign. Well, when you're dealing with a premise that depends on a comparison to the inference from analogy, there's 5, there can be more, assumptions that must also be considered in determining on the strength or the degree of truth that one should attach to the premise underneath it. For example, 2a, there are no critical differences sufficient to destroy the analogy. So while there may be some similarities, if there's a lot of critical dissimilarities, then you shouldn't be relying on that analogy. Or 2c, there are a sufficient amount of similarities to give assurance that other characteristics are shared. So you can see that when you're, and we're not going to go into the details of reasoning by analogy here. I'm just trying to make you aware that when you are, there is an assumption set that accompanies that premise. Here's 5 of them here that, again, you need to be considering in determining how much certainty can be supported by the premise that relies on that. Finally, we're going to talk about the assumption set that goes when you're doing inferring by generalizing. And here we've got 2 premises. The sample of citizens polled indicates that the voting public generally believes the president's citizenship claim. Premise 2, any such that indicates that the voting public generally believes the president's citizenship claim sufficiently proves by generalizing induction that actually the voting public generally believes the president's citizenship claim. And therefore then we have the conclusion, the sample of citizens polled sufficiently proves by generalizing induction that actually the voting public generally believes the president's citizenship claim. Well, when you're generalizing in this fashion, here's at least 5 assumptions that accompany that process. Probably the most common one that people are familiar with is 2D, that there are enough facts to support the inference that all unknown relevant facts will support the same conclusion. This would be an adequate sample size. So if the size of the sample of the citizens you polled were 5 people, then the strength of this premise number 2 would be highly suspect, because this assumption would not be met. So, just in summary, remember that when you're dealing with a reliability of source issue, when you're using analogy, when you're generalizing from a sample, you need to remember and consider the effect of the assumption sets that are integral to the argument that's involved with those kind of premises. Thank you.